Right, okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming for this session. And just a quick check to make sure you're at the right session. This is the one, the Asian Phenotype. Okay, great. Okay, I'm Benjamin. I'm the Executive Director of the Biomedical Research Council in A*STAR. Very privileged to be invited to chair this session. An interesting topic, it is about the Asian phenotype and whether this is an unmet medical need. And with me, I think I've got a very distinguished panel. I'll leave them to just very quickly introduce themselves, starting with Patrick.
Hi, my name is Patrick Tan. I'm a faculty member at the Duke NUS Medical School and a Deputy Executive Director of the Biomedical Research Council. And we have a program in cancer genomics.
Hi, my name is John Conley. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of Testa Therapeutics. Testa Therapeutics is a clinical stage Singapore biotech company focused on cancer immunotherapy.
Mark?
I'm Mark Richards. I'm Director of the Cardiovascular Research Institute at National University of Singapore. I also direct simultaneously a very parallel designed and active institute at one of the New Zealand universities. So I see east-west perspectives all the time, practically every day. And our current major programs in Singapore include a bench-to-bedside biology to clinical practice program on heart failure, and also very broad spread activity in arterial disease with a particular focus on coronary artery disease.
And Laurent.
Yeah, good morning. So I'm Laurent Mess. I'm leading the market access function for Johnson & Johnson medical device in Asia. So what does it mean? So it's R&D function. We develop data for the value proposition of the innovation and solution, mainly for the economic decision makers, so the payers, the provider, and the policy makers. So it's one part, and the other aspect, it's also we look at innovative financial solution to increase the patient affordability for them to afford new technology.
Okay, so we've got everything from the scientist to the clinician to the big company and the small company. So Patrick, I'm just going to start off with you. Could you just in very simple terms explain what is the Asian phenotype?
So I think the Asian phenotype really represents conditions that you see in Asia that are different, that are endemic to this part of the world. And Asia is a big place. So maybe in my area, in this area of cancer, we anticipate that over the next 2 decades or so, Asia will probably represent 70% of the world's cancer deaths. So I think if you look at it from a demand perspective, your potential market perspective, that's quite interesting. Critically, the cancers that will dominate that mortality most of them will actually be different from that you see in Western countries. And I'm just going to give you a few examples on, can I have a slide number 5, please? It turns out that in terms of
That's not your slide.
yeah, So it turns out that one very interesting aspect of many Asian cancers is that they're actually caused by very defined exposures, be it toxins, bacteria, viruses. Here are some examples that we've been involved with. I'll just highlight 2 examples to give you a sense of the numbers. The third one, which is biliary tract cancer, is very rare in the United States and the West, but in the northeast of Thailand, about 20 million people live there. It's the #1 cancer in incidence. We're talking about 15,000 new cases diagnosed every year, of which about half of them will die in the first year of diagnosis. And it's caused by exposure to a liver fluke that lives in the fresh water, which lives in the fish that the villagers eat. And then while eating it, the liver fluke enters the liver and causes inflammation and bile duct cancer. So that's one example of a very interesting interaction between the Asian environment and Asian populations. The right-hand side, the last one, is a type of urinary tract cancer that's very prevalent in Taiwan. And the studies we're working with the collaborators, we found that it's probably linked to exposure to a specific type of component in traditional Chinese medicine that's actually mutagenic and causes that type of disease. So, but not everybody that exposes it. So the exposures in Asia are different, but also the genetics of Asia is different. Can I have slide 4, please?
6 you probably want.
Slide 4, please. No, sorry, slide 6, sorry.
This is slide 6.
Slide 4, slide 4. Yeah, this one.
Okay.
So it turns out that the genetics of Asia they are very different also. We have different gene profiles, molecular profiles, and I think one of the contributions from Asia is to understand the diversity of Asia, understanding how these differences also contribute to disease outcome. And in Singapore, I chair the National Program on Precision Medicine, and one of the goals we'll be doing is to try to catalog genetic variation, clinical variation in Asian populations, so that we can be able to understand this interaction between genes and the environment in a more detailed fashion. I'll stop there.
Maybe I'm going to move across to Mark. So Mark, you've come from New Zealand to Singapore. You are one of the people looking after the Asian Heart Failure Network and Registry. So in heart failure, is there an Asian phenotype? Do Asians present differently? Do they respond to treatment differently?
Yes, there is a difference between East and West, but it's not the same difference that Patrick is describing. I think in cardiovascular disease you have the same risk factors and the same presentation of the disease, but the relationship between risk and disease is radically different. Mm-hmm. So if I could have slide number 1 probably. If you line up a bunch of people going through a cardiac assessment in the West and in the East, can I have slide number 1 please? You'll find that if they have coronary angiography, that for an apparently similar process of recruitment, just there, you'll get a different level of disease. So these, for example, are comparing contemporaneously studied and recruited Dutch people with Singapore people. The columns on the right represent Chinese, Indian, and Malays from Singapore, and the coloured columns represent the most severe grade of coronary disease, triple vessel disease. You see the Dutch people on the left with that orange column have a relatively low proportion of high-grade severe coronary disease, and almost, well, all 3 ethnicities in Singapore, particularly the Malays, have much more pronounced prevalence of high-grade disease. But if you look at their background risk, how many are hypertensive, how many have lipid problems, how many have diabetes, you'll find that those rates are a little bit different, but the amount of apparent disease associated with a degree of risk seems to be exaggerated, particularly in the case of diabetes. Next slide, please. When we turn to heart failure, for example, we've compared Singapore people who have heart failure, and they're shown in the red columns here, with Swedish people. Swedes have a fantastic registry for heart failure and other forms of cardiovascular disease, and we've done a contemporaneous head-to-head comparison. And what this really shows is if you move through the grades of body mass index, so on the left-hand side of those columns, you've got 20 kilograms per meter square. Those are lean people. 20 to 25, normal weight, at least in Western standards. And 25 and above to 30, overweight, over 30, obese. The grades are actually shifted a little bit to the left for Asians because they tend to have just generally lighter mass for body height as a general principle. But what the slide shows that even down at lean body weights, the chance of an Asian person in Singapore having diabetes compared with a white Swedish person in Sweden having diabetes is several-fold different, even when you're lean or normal body weight. So there's something going on there, whether it's environment, genetic interaction, or something else we have yet to really define, because actually all of this cardiovascular research is well behind what we see in cancer. Next slide, and last slide, I think. This just shows what happens in terms of outcomes if you're a diabetic person or a non-diabetic person in red in Singapore with heart failure in red and dotted red lines respectively. The difference between outcomes if you're diabetic with heart failure compared with non-diabetic with heart failure is bigger in Singapore. It's more of an impact. It colours the outcome of that disease more powerfully than it does in a white cohort contemporaneously studied on the other side of the world. And the other major thing is that everything is happening earlier. Doesn't matter what you pick, whether it's a heart attack, a stroke, heart failure onset, you're talking about a decade earlier onset on average. These data are from Singapore, but as Ben says, we've looked at Asian HF, which is a registry which collects data from about 45 centres dotted over 11 parts of Asia, including multiple countries within Southeast Asia, Japan, India, China. And what we find is that the average age of onset of heart failure is much lower than it is in any Western jurisdiction. The average age in China in the 5 centres we study there is about 58 years. In my hometown, Christchurch, 75 years, and that's very typical for a white Western country. So what's going on? We don't know. There may be a lot to do with transition, and there might be a lot to do with the interaction between different ethnic genetic substrates and the change in lifestyle and activity over time. But it is more complicated than that, because even a lean Asian person is more prone to diabetes, for example. And this plays into how you would go about timing of diagnostics, how you would try and use epigenetic or genetic characteristics to predict disease in Asia compared with the West. And it would even play into how soon you would chart treatments in one part of the world compared with another. I think I'll just stop at that point. Thanks, Ben.
Maybe before I go to the next 2 speakers, I just want to ask Patrick and Mark another question. I mean, Mark, you mentioned transition a few times, and for the cancers that Patrick highlighted, they were caused primarily by liver flukes, oriental medicines. So I think as the environment changes, as Asian countries get more developed, more affluent, more westernized, do you think we'll actually see the Asian phenotype slowly disappear?
Hopefully. But it's going to take a very, very long time. We are starting from a huge base of patients, and even if we intercepted today, it would probably be 20, 30 years before you see the impact of those interventions. The populations are aging. So for instance, gastric cancer, which is where we work, yes, we are now beginning to intercept the disease early with antibiotic therapy to treat the bacteria. Yet at the same time, the population is aging. And so what happens is that you're actually going to see an absolute incidence and an increase in the number of cases rather than a decrease, probably for the next 30 years before we see the impact of those interventions. So it will eventually decline, perhaps, but probably not for a long time.
Mark, what do you think?
I think the experiment's been ongoing. So in London, for example, there's a big population of South Asians. They were epidemiologically looked at first about 25 years ago. In fact, John Chambers, who's in Singapore now, led that. And the obvious striking thing was the prevalence of diabetes for a given level of background, apparent risk factor, was 2 or 3-fold higher, and so was cardiovascular disease in these London-based populations. But actually, 30 years later, the difference is still there. So either people are carrying cultural behaviours that are very adverse into the Western setting, or there's a phenotype that's got a lot of endurance associated with it.
Okay. So now let me move to the commercial side. So Laurent, you come from J&J, a very big company. How does a company like yours look at the Asian phenotype? Do you customize drugs, products for Asian populations?
Can you have slide 6, please?
7.
2 more slides later. Next, yep, I think that's the one.
Yeah, so medical device, it's really more about surgery. And so if for instance, if you take the example of osteoarthritis, which is in fact a big burden worldwide in the region. So to give you an idea, it's between the burden of osteoarthritis, about between 1% and 2% of GDP for a country. So it's a big burden. At some point you need, for instance, for knee osteoarthritis, you need a knee surgery. And when you look at we'll go more in details, but when you look at the knee morphology, there are some, in fact, differences between Western and Asian population. And one of the success of the knee surgery is really the correct sizing between the implant itself and the anatomy of the patient. And so the point is that most of the implants, most of them have been designed for Western population, and we use this implant in Asian population. So the question is, you have a mismatch, some time of components between the Western implant in Asian population. So the question is, what about the outcome? So next slide. So you see first, in terms of anatomy, the patient tend to be smaller in Asia, but it's more complicated than that because you have also bone morphology. It's also different, and I will get back to that. The other thing as well to look is the lifestyle are different. So there is more, like squatting, kneeling position. So the thing is, lifestyle is different, and patient may have a different expectation in terms of outcome of the surgery. They may be more demanding in terms of flexion post-surgery. So next slide. So here you have more details about the difference in terms of morphology of the bone between Asian and Caucasian population. So if you look at the first line, it's what we call the varus deformity in the middle. So in Caucasian population, it's about 25% of the population. In Asia, it's 34. And also, when you look at the last line, the bowing of the femur, it's also more present in Asian population compared to Caucasian population. On the last part of the slide, you see, so it's femur measurements, or whatever are the measurements. So you see the black line, it's the measurements that has been done in Thailand in the population of Thai for women. So you see this black line, and the dots are the size of the implant available on the market. So you see that for some part of the black line, there is no matching between the implant available and the size required for the woman patient in Thailand. So again, there is, due to anatomic difference, there is this mismatch between the implant developed in the for Western country, for Western population, and the bone morphology of Asian population. So the question is, what about the outcome? There are not a lot of research from that. I think it's a relatively new field of investigation in clinical research, but it's really, I mean, there are some clear differences between population.
Okay. Now, maybe if I move to John in small Singapore biotech. So Tessa is doing some really interesting work on immunotherapy for Asian cancer. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, no problem. So as I mentioned before, we're a clinical stage biotech company, and we really started off with some of the clinical trials here. So as a homegrown company, we're focused on the cancers that are here in Southeast Asia. And one of the biggest cancers is nasopharyngeal carcinoma, one that Patrick highlighted, a virus-driven cancer. And so what Tessa has done is it's focused on that cancer and tried to push that forward into late-stage clinical trials. So we're currently running a phase 3, 30-center, 5-country clinical trial. But we always have an eye on this really as a global trial. You know, so we have U.S. sites, we've got sites outside of Asia and some of these centers. But I think really this just reflects the global nature of the Asian population. That the Asian diaspora really is represented throughout all of the major cities in the world. And so when we're addressing these types of cancers, we want to have a clinical presence across the globe as a local biotech.
Okay. No, I think that's an interesting point to discuss. When we look at the Asian patient, I mean, obviously Asia is it is the largest population base globally. 650 million people in ASEAN, 1.1 in India, 1.3 in China. So it's a huge consumer and patient base. It is also where some of the fastest growing economies, other than India and China, I think when you look at the data, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam are some of the fastest growing economies, expanding middle income populations, increasing healthcare consumption. So I think when you look at it, there is a huge market out there. At the same time, I think we have had various examples, and I think it does actually cut across many other diseases as well, that Asians do present differently, whether it's in terms of the phenotype or how they respond to treatment. But at the same time, I think there is actually a dearth of customized drugs, treatments for many Asian diseases. I think with orthopedic implants, I think that's a good example of where some of these modifications are necessary. And I have been to medical school a long time ago, so maybe what I've learned was updated. But maybe, Mark, do we treat Asians differently in the cardiac clinics in your hospital?
There are some obvious differences. Some of these are even enshrined in international guideline documents and outside of Asia to address the Asian populations in places like the US.
Sure.
So two good examples would be two very widely prescribed drug classes, converting enzyme inhibitors for heart failure and for hypertension, Common side effect is cough, generally mild and a very rather small percentage in Caucasian populations, but actually affecting anything up to 20%, even at low dose in Asian populations, particularly Chinese Asian populations. So you have to think about dose or using an alternative. And the other major class that comes to mind are statins. So statins are almost in the water in Western countries now because they have this global overall effect on cardiovascular events, particularly in the secondary setting where someone's already had some indication of a coronary event or a stroke or peripheral arterial disease. So statins are very widely used. Their common side effect is muscle pain, and in the extreme case, muscle destruction. And in fact, that's something that Asian people are more vulnerable to. And in fact, the dose recommendations have been adjusted in the American guidelines. Ironically, I'm not sure that there is such an equivalent change in, say, a China guideline at the moment. In Singapore, we use an amalgam or a distillation of European and US guidelines, and they are often further modified by local practitioners to adjust for local experience and understanding. So, yeah, I think drugs do operate differently in cardiovascular disease and with different concerns here than in the West.
But do you actually have different packaging for Asian patients?
Well,
because
no.
I actually have never seen that.
No, there's no different packaging, but everybody who, that's a very bad thing to say, but people who are familiar with a particular form of practice, they rapidly become acquainted with things like the dose adjustments. And typically in Asia, almost all of the classes of cardiovascular drug are prescribed at a lower level than elsewhere. There are local influences which are interesting. For example, China focused upon one class of anti-failure drug called mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, and they have a prototype form called spironolactone, which is cheap as chips. It's been off any kind of marketing radar for decades. So they pushed it, and in fact, China has by far the largest uptake of that particular drug class for heart failure compared with any other zone. So it's an example of actually economic pressures weighing even more than medical considerations in a large part of Asia.
Laurent, would you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so I think I would say you mentioned that Asian patients have different needs. I think one of the first question is really to understand how the needs are different. Because, for instance, when you look at knee surgery, patients are interested by post-surgery. They are interested by how the prosthesis work, but they are also interested a lot about functionality. And the functionality may be different between Western population and Asian population. So when you develop, patient-related outcome and the quality of life scale, you have to really validate this measurement into the local population to understand the local needs. So it's the first thing to understand. Then in terms of treatment, so yes, for instance, hip and especially knee implants, you develop more size to make sure you fit to the anatomy of the Asian population. Some company in Asia Pacific, like Japanese company, have developed some specific knee implant for Japanese population. So it's another if you want, specificity. And after, the surgery itself may be different. So for instance, there is more. You have to correct the deformity that are more prevalent in Asia. Also, the post-op, also you may give also different advice. So, for instance, after knee surgery, you may want the patient to avoid the kneeling or squatting position for a long time. That may also damage the implant. So, yeah, there are some specificity. First, in terms of understanding the need, developing the product, and surgical treatment. And the post-surgical management of the patient.
Okay. So John, back to you. I think when you look at Asian cancers like nasopharyngeal, hepatocellular carcinoma, I guess you've done your market comparison studies. What is the market like? How many? What's the competition like? What's the market like?
No, it's a great question. So for nasopharyngeal carcinoma specifically, but we can talk more broadly about some of these cancers, it's absolutely enormous. So for the NPC trial we have now, which is the largest T-cell therapy trial in the world, we have orphan drug fast track status in the US because it's such a rare disease in the United States, EBV-driven NPC. Yet we have 100,000 cases probably underreported 100,000 cases in Asia, including China. And so this is, it's an enormous opportunity for a company that's in a late-stage market to develop therapeutics here in Southeast Asia. I think one of the things, just looking at the talks in the presentation so far, that I think comes out, and it's absolutely the view of a small company that's homegrown, is that I think I would challenge the title of this seminar, so that there is an Asian phenotype. I think what we're talking about is the most, unquestionably, and actually in all measures, the most diverse population in the world, both from lifestyle, from diet, from genetics, across the board when you talk about all of Asia. And so it in itself is a self-contained market that has its own subpopulations, whether it's Thai, Chinese, et cetera, across there. And so a company that can come in and begin to define these new standards of care in this market, it's just a huge opportunity. And this is what we've seen with Tessa, and I'm sure other biotech companies that are coming up across Asia are seeing the same kind of thing. The other aspect of this market that's really different in the context of cancer is that in the West, we went from surgery to radiotherapy to chemotherapy over a period of a century. Here you have markets that are going from surgery to combination immunotherapy, just like that, as they begin to open up to these kind of therapies. And so in order to really exploit that, you have to be here. You have to set up these clinical centers. You have to work with these populations. And this is something that I think is a really different experience from, say, US biotech or European biotech.
Just 2 points to raise at that. So I think there's an opportunity, particularly for the small companies. So I sit on the scientific advisory board of another local biotech called Aslan. And their focus is on Asian cancers, particularly biliary tract cancer. And what they've realized is that it's actually easier, because it's an orphan disease, to get approval for those drugs, which then opens up the ability to apply those drugs to other indications. It just makes it easier. So I think from a company perspective, it actually is a strategic move. So you're helping these underserved orphan diseases, but at the same time, you're giving your company a competitive edge. So I think that's one area. I think one also aspect of the Asian phenotype that I think also is that the patients receive information differently. And I think there's a contextualized, and there's value in companies' initiatives that can contextualize that information. So I'll give you one example. We're working with Duke University on a tool called Mitri, which is an online tool for individuals to key in personal family history information. It's a very important risk factor in terms of dictating healthcare outcomes. And we tried it. We got it from North Carolina, came in here, and the results that in the inputs we got, what's the notion of a family, was all over the place, right? And how it's perceived. So there's now a need to recontextualize that so you can get the information that is required in a way that it can be cross-compared to other populations. I think there's going to be value in those initiatives that contextualize these things, that also receive the data and interpret it for Asian patients in Asian populations.
No, I think both of you have brought up an interesting point. You've talked about fast-tracking FDA regulation because these are genetic diseases. I mean, these are often diseases, rare diseases, but they are actually not very rare in Asia. So they are extremely common, prevalent cancers, major killers in the hundreds of thousands of cases that you have mentioned. And yet we are sort of trying to take a fast-track orphan disease track through a North American or a European regulatory agency. So why hasn't it happened in Asia? So, I mean, obviously these are pressing problems that all the economists face here. So why hasn't there been enough activity to actually address it within Asia?
So I can speak from the standpoint of immunotherapy for cancer, because we've dealt with the regulators of 5 different countries, and including US FDA. And so a lot of these regulatory agencies, these are new treatments. In some of the cases, we're actually working with the regulators to write the regulation to regulate us, because that's where we are right now. This is very advanced therapy. But they're actually really open to it. I think that as the market's open, as people get more and more patients in all these countries get more and more information, there's a call and there's a need for these advanced therapies. And so the regulators are responding to that. But it is early days for some of these therapies. In the case of China, for instance, the cell therapy regulations right now are being written for China. So it was kind of wide open. The CFDA closed it down. And now they're writing these regulations. And they're writing them not just following the US FDA. They're writing their own regulations for their own populations. And I think this is it's a great experience to be there to help influence that, and then also to address and respond to the individual populations. So it's just early days.
Okay. Any other views on this?
I think it's surprising how little we know about some really obvious questions. So, for example, the Asian HF registry that I described briefly, that's the first time anybody's actually had that relatively fine-grained look at multiple Asian heart failure practices and experiences around Asia. The very first time, from 2010. But we assume we know all these differences, but actually good documentation, fine-grained analysis is very much lacking, and particularly in cardiovascular disease. I think cancer has several streets advantage ahead of cardiovascular disease. What we're looking at in cardiovascular disease is a surging game that will follow prosperity. You'll have 20% of the population who need antihypertensives, a similar proportion or higher who need antilipids, a lot of people who need surveillance and early diagnosis and aggressive management of diabetes, similar proportions, massive markets which will be becoming affordable as economies grow and need to be rolled out over a large portion of the population.
Maybe just one more.
Ben,
Sorry.
can I just also, you challenge us to say, is the composition and the packaging of the products different for Asian populations? And I think for the pharmaceuticals, that's not the case, right? There are industries where that's commonplace. So for the food industry, the Coca-Cola that you buy in the US tastes different from the Coca-Cola that you buy in Asia. And I think in the cosmetics industry, the cosmetics that you buy they're the same brand, the same product, but actually they're different. So I think that that's an example of a very big market where they've already learned that customization provides value. So I just wanted to put it out there.
Okay. Before I open this to the audience, just one more question for Mark. In one of your graphs, you actually showed differences between 3 ethnic Asian groups, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Malays. So is the Asian phenotype a misnomer? Because Asia is so heterogeneous and diverse. You have everyone from Central Asia to North Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So is there really an Asian phenotype?
I think it's a very good question. The answer is obviously there are multiple Asian phenotypes. I think that's what John and Patrick have already said. I mean, a good example would be from the cardiac point of view. For some reason, Indian people, South Asians, if you like, don't get much atrial fibrillation. It's an abnormal, very common, abnormal irregular heart rhythm. Much less than Han Chinese descendant people or Malay people. We have no idea why. So there are distinct phenotypes. So there's some generalizations, more diabetes across the board, more arterial disease for a given level of diabetes across the board, but there are sub-phenotypes which are quite pronounced, and they'll become more and more detailed and filled out over the next few years. Yeah.
Okay. I'd now like to open the session to the floor. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience? Takes a little bit of time to warm up. Anything from anyone? Right, please go ahead.
It's a very selfish question. As an Asian Canadian living there all my life, do I have the Asian phenotype?
Well,
I think you need to make an appointment.
The London study was interesting, but in
Yeah.
Asian Americans, are you finding that people who basically...
There are distinctions that still apply to Asian people living in the US. I don't know much about Canada, but in the US, these issues of reaction to drug forms seem to carry on through over next generations. So I don't know exactly what your Asian bits are like, and I can't answer your specific question, but I think there are some phenotypes that will endure no matter how long you're acculturated into a different culture, and other things that clearly will be malleable. And we don't really know quite which is which perfectly yet. Yeah.
Perhaps I can respond to that. I suspect that if I sequence your genome, or you may have done it already, I will be able to tell what your ancestry is. And you then have to ask the question, does what you're born with influence your health? There's a strong argument that certain aspects will. And I think you also have interesting things in Asia where even in one individual, which Asian phenotype are you? Because you have intermarriages, 10% of my genome is Malay. At some point in my family tree, something happened. And so now you have interesting intermixes of different Asian phenotypes in the same individual. Now, isn't that interesting to think about how these all then integrate and contribute both the ethnic aspects as well as the molecular aspects? And I think that all this comes to, at the end of the day, it shows how that influences you as an individual. And I think that's really interesting to think about.
Are there other questions from the audience? If not, I guess as a moderator, I can ask questions of the audience as well. And I see Russell Gruen sitting in the front from the Duke Medical School, Lee Kong Chian Medical School in Singapore that's linked to Imperial. So Russell, I think when we look at medical education in Singapore, all our textbooks are written in either the US or UK, some from Europe. And yet we use these textbooks to teach Asian students in Singapore and I guess across the rest of Asia in terms of how to actually treat medical conditions. So the first-line treatments for hypertension, for diabetes, heart problems, all actually follow the Western education system. So do you teach differently in your school? And how do you go about doing that?
That's a great question, Dan, and you didn't plant it. So, so I think you're asking a broader phenotypic question, which is also about, is there a phenotype to the education that people get? Do we teach different types of students differently? And in fact, do we as educators, Western, Asian, teach differently? My first response to the question is that we're using textbooks much less than we have in the past, and that particularly at the new medical schools like Lee Kong Chian, we're teaching students to find the information they need when they need it, so on time, on demand sort of information sources. And I think we are therefore training them to go to the information that they want to find. If it's an Asian patient, they should be looking for Asian materials, not just going to their old-fashioned Western textbook. We're also teaching in new and different ways, which are not just about absorbing information. We're teaching in new and different ways, not just about absorbing information and regurgitating in the exam, but actually in a much more conversational, team-based learning approach. And Ben, I think you've seen the LKC medicine classrooms. Similarly at Duke, they've adopted the same message where students come to class to work as groups. They don't actually sit in lectures anymore. And as groups around a 6-person table, they find information they need, they challenge each other, they learn to communicate, they learn to be respectful of other people's views, and they learn to think on their feet more than I did in my Western medical school, and more than I think students who go through traditional lecture-based curricula. So without answering the question, should we be teaching about phenotypes, I think there's so many changes in medical education which are changing the way we teach doctors of the future to think and approach problems, that hopefully they're all pointing in the same direction, that the patients in front of them will get the right care for them going into the future.
Any other views? Mark? We have a very quiet audience today. Please.
I think the question, the deeper question might be, how long are we heading towards personalized medicine? Diagnosis and treatment. One thing has not been mentioned is gender. I mean, a lot of the studies have been, the average person was a 70-kilo male, right? That was the way, I'm also trained medicine. That's how we were, there's a huge gender bias as well. So I would love to hear the panel's views. As Dr. Tan said, in this industry, we don't package it for the individual, much less the ethnicity. Thanks.
I think that's a huge area that, to be very honest, we lack an understanding of why some of these gender-specific differences exist. For many of these cancers, we have known for a long time that there is a sex bias. It's usually the guys that get the short shrift. It's their liver cancers, biliary tract, stomach cancers. They're all male dominant. Even if after you can control for exposures. Now, the mechanism of that, I think, is still hotly investigated. I think you understand that, and you also understand not just about what protects the cancers in women, but also perhaps provides an inroad on how you can use that information to better treat the tumor. Could be protective effects of estrogen, beta, many different things. But I think that's a fascinating area that still needs to be dissected out. Thanks very much for raising that point. I think it's critically important.
Yeah, it's definitely, just to follow up on Patrick says, it's a point that's being recognized, I think, across the board scientifically. The bias occurs everywhere, from cell lines to mouse models to all the way through the development pipeline. And I think that from a regulatory standpoint, certainly from a funding standpoint in the United States, you have to actually say why you're not using mixed, why you made a choice to just use males or females now. And I think that those kind of questions are certainly in our pipeline when we're developing products, because we don't want to get caught in a situation like I think people have seen in cardiology with some of these medications that have radical differences in gender.
Mark, do you want to talk about gender?
Okay. I mean, there are two parts to your question/comment, and one was to do with sex. I think you're talking about sex rather than gender, actually, female versus male. Gender's another thing. And the other question is personalised, so they overlap. So in cardiovascular medicine, we still see major differences between men and women. So any coronary care unit around the world, you'll find is 70 to 80% occupied by men. And the women that appear in the coronary care unit will be 5 to 10 years older than the men who appear there. So they have a lag advantage, you know, variously attributed to being estrogen protected until menopause, that kind of thinking. But once they do incur disease, they do badly. They tend to have finer caliber vessels, which are harder for all our mechanical approaches to coronary arteries, for example, to deal with. They tend to have, for some reason, probably deeply instilled bias in many medical systems, a lesser introduction or recruitment into advanced programs, surgery, transplant, etc. Women are always underrepresented in cardiovascular cohorts in the West. I can't speak for Asia on this particular point. So there are very distinct differences, and we're still unraveling exactly what the biology behind those differences is and how to best compensate for them and give people a truly equal or the best personal opportunity. So that's the sex issue. The personalised medicine thing, I mean, that is the noise, and I think it's what we're all aiming towards. So at the moment, I think Patrick and I are both engaged in sort of broad-based research programs which are asking this question: if you can really define someone in fine detail so that you can attach the right treatment to the right person, whether that's an epigenetic or genetic signal or some circulating marker signal or some other cruder imaging signal or a sophisticated imaging signal, some sort of recipe that enables you to dissect out one woman from another, so that instead of treating 100 people to have benefit for 20, you treat 20 people who need it to get benefit for 20. So it's the holy grail, and we're all shooting for it. I don't think I'm going to see it in my remaining working lifetime. Mind you, that's probably not very long, but it's within view of the next generation, I think, people. And it's what a lot of biology is hunting now, actively pursuing. Yeah.
I saw Alok.
Yeah. So I have a comment, because this is not about Asian patient phenotypes. And one of the observations I've had...
Could we have the mic to the front?
Sorry, so Alok from Value Addition, but 20 years at J&J in MedTech. One observation we had on unmet medical needs is the surgeon phenotype. Because we made these staplers and instruments in the US for large Western hands, and when we went to Japan, they said, this is not going to work for us. In fact, when we came up with powered staplers and stuff, there was a great acceptance here. So you do see this difference from an unmet medical need point of view. And the other one was in terms of the Asian skin, when it comes to surgical healing, there's a lot more keloid formation in some skins. And that has implications for what sutures you could use and things like that.
So you have your voice.
Yeah, so getting back to your question, Alok's point. Yeah, so there are more, so when I was in medical school, there was already more women than men in the class. So there are, I mean, today you have a lot of women that are surgeons, so they tend to have a smaller hand. So as Alok mentioned, In medical device, of course, you have more, the life cycle of the product are shorter than the pharmaceutical industry, so you have more flexibility to develop something more specific if you want for the surgeon. So the instruments, develop smaller instruments because there are more women who are surgeons, number one. So I mentioned the knee implant, there are some study. There are some companies that are developed, not a lot, but there are some companies that have developed specific implant for female, for instance. So in terms of more personalized medicine, so medical device, I've heard not a lot of companies, but I know that there is one company in China that developed for the stent, below the knee stent, they develop the stent specific to the patient anatomy. So they develop one stent for one specific patient. And I think, again, in orthopedy with, 3D printing, you will be able to develop much quicker product really designed for a specific patient. So in medical device, it's in surgery, it's happening right now, if you want, yeah.
I think the phenotype that I notice comparing Asian cardiologists in Singapore with cardiologists in Australia and New Zealand is versatility. So people here have to speak usually 2, 3, sometimes 4 languages or resort to interpretation. And they're faced with a cultural preference for minimally invasive or least invasive interventions. They do not want open chest cardiac surgery. They will want coronary intervention that's by keyhole, by catheter. And so the practitioners here are incredibly good at dealing with technically really difficult stuff. I mean, when I came naively from Christchurch to Singapore, I thought, I've lived most of my working life in a degenerate, heavily diseased, atherosclerotic, aging white. I've seen the worst you can see. I was completely wrong. So people here deal with young men who have fine caliber triple vessel disease, who refuse to have surgery and need to have quite complex, minimally invasive technical procedures done to get a reasonable result. And people here deliver. I mean, the cardiologists here deliver. So they're multilingual, versatile, and prepared to try very difficult things with a high measure of success because they're exposed to it all the time, have to do it all the time.
Please go ahead. So Jeff?
Yeah, just one thing, because the phenotype also not only covers physiological, genomic differences, but also environmental and behavioral differences. These are factors that are not typically covered very heavily in clinical trials. And so I just wanted to kind of get the sense of the panel how much we also need to be looking at collecting real-world evidence, real-world data that actually can look at how patients with the same diseases are treated in the clinic, how they actually, let's say, if they're taking traditional medicine on the side, is that being captured? What do they eat? I mean, the difference between Malays and Chinese, for instance, is at least partially due to they have different diets and so forth. So collecting data, real-world data post-product launch and using that to refine treatments, using that data, what is the panel's kind of view on how we can get better at understanding the real-world evidence?
So I hear you there. In the National Cancer Center, even though they don't declare it, we know that probably about half of our patients are on some form of traditional Chinese medicine while receiving chemotherapy and traditional Western. So you have to think about those interactions. I think the collection of real-world data is critically important, and it's not so easy to collect it in the clinical, within the hospital environment. You're really talking about where do they travel, what do they buy, what do they eat. And so I think as part of the national program, we're engaging with partners and trying to collect that sort of the weather information, the building sense of the exposure history outside, and to integrate that as part of a common database where we can begin to look at and synthesize all of that data. The proliferation of smartphones and devices and wearables now allows you to capture that information in a way that wasn't possible before. And
I was going to say, 2 years ago, doctors were typically saying they didn't really care how many steps you took.
yes.
But now it's integrated with, let's say, your blood pressure data on the same device. It starts to matter.
and all of us wear a smart device. So I think that now it's exciting that now you are able to capture not just the clinical data, what you see, but also everything else, what you're born with, what is clinical disease, what you do in a day-to-day life, and then combining that to integrate into how can I impact your individual healthcare. And that's going to happen, I think.
Any comments on that, Mark?
I think that the same is reflected in cardiovascular experience, practice, and research, exactly as Patrick is outlining, really. And in fact, you must have been talking to the wrong doctor if 2 years ago they didn't care how many steps you took. You might want to look into that. Right. Because I think we've always been interested in exercise. At a crude level, when we run registries like the Asian Heart Failure, we do try and get information about your level of income, education, drinking habits, and some crude index of exercise, and also quality of life, which touches on multiple domains such as self-sufficiency and ability to do this and that. It's not really good enough. And I think the way through is what Patrick's describing, is to have devices. The social geographers are ahead of us here. So if you can actually objectively quantify how much someone's moving around during the day, how many stairs they literally climb, and get that information objectively rather than asking them to guesstimate, and also asking people how much they drink is a lost cause, particularly in Western countries. It's hopeless. It's always about a quarter of the reality. So yeah, we need technologies that catch up to get a full picture of sociological, dietary, and exercise-related risk, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think for in medical device, I think the same. I think, for instance, when you getting back to the app you develop, to help the patient managing post-surgery. When we look at the functionality, what we want to develop in the app, we validate in the local country with a local KOL and a focus group with patient to make sure we capture the local specificity. Yeah. Yeah. The same for the outcome of real-world evidence. I think we validate the outcome in first. I mean, you have to validate the outcome in the local population. And the other thing as well, when you apply for regulatory submission or reimbursement, you have to make sure that the authorities recognize the quality of life scales you have developed in this specific country.
So from the standpoint of cancer therapeutics, where you in a drug development standpoint, this is absolutely essential. And we have very recent examples of substratification of patient populations based on biomarkers that really come from exactly what you're talking about, lifestyle biomarkers, you name it. And so if a company can target their therapy to a particular subpopulation that responds better, this is the difference between approval and licensing and a complete failure on a phase 3 trial. And so it's essential to work with teams like Patrick and the capabilities of people that are there to collect this information on the trials. Because not only is it essential for a biomarker discovery and a registration process, it also points to the mechanism of resistance and action to your therapy. So that's really your pipeline, is based on studying your patients on those trials.
Okay. So I've been told that we've used up our time, but I think just to quickly sum up, I think when we've looked at the Asian phenotype, it is a really broad topic down to differences in the patients in terms of the environmental exposures, the cultural influences, the genetic influences on the disease. We went all the way from drugs for cancer, chronic diseases, medical implants, and even looked at customizing products for the Asian doctor and the Asian surgeon. So I think when we look at it, obviously with the huge consumer base, patient base, there are still many medical problems that do not have the solutions that we want for them. And clearly, I think there are many opportunities for companies, big and small, investors, to actually look at how to actually take advantage of the fast-track mechanism that we've heard that's taken by 2 Singapore drug companies in terms of getting this into the North American and European markets and then expanding into Asia. I think before we leave, I'd just like each of the panelists to maybe in just 1 or 2 lines just give a key takeaway point to the audience before we close the session. Patrick?
Thank you for your time. I think that we actually are interested in working with partners for the national program on how we can put this data to good use yet protecting patient confidentiality. So I think that if you have interest in this area, we should talk.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your time. We're very interested in this concept of the Asian phenotype, and I think that from the standpoint of a company that's a homegrown company, you have to really do your trials here to capture that phenotype. But realistically, as I mentioned before, this is a massive population. This is a growing population, and this is a global population. And so the work that you're doing here as a company, whether it's a large company or a small company, with this population is really defining the next generation therapies for this expanding market.
But in terms of cardiovascular disease, I think Asia is experiencing huge populations undergoing very rapid change in association with widespread increasing prevalence of conventional risk factors. They seem to be coming on earlier and producing a more severe consequence than they do for all other things being equal in Western populations. Some of that will melt away as transition to first world economies and behaviours is solidified over the next generation or two. Some of it won't go away, and we'll end up with very specific niche applications of management that are basically Asian or even sub-Asian, different Asian phenotypes specific.
Laurent, you have the final word.
Yeah, thank you. So at the broader standpoint of access, I think if really you want to be and for medical device, if you really want to be successful in the long term in Asia, you really have to develop product that answer the need of the local population. I think is the key to success in the long term.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank our speakers. I think we have had a very engaging conversation. I did notice the audience slowly disappearing to the Naomi Campbell session that's coming up next, but we'll live that. But with that, could we just thank them in the usual way?